Anyway, welcome back to day 2 of this special issue presentation. For those of you who haven't been here yesterday, as you probably know from the program, I'm one of the editors of this special issue called The Print Culture of Conspiracist Antisemitism, 1917 to 1945, which I was working on together with Kjetil, my co-editor, and we have several papers which analyze conspiracist anti-Semitism in the Nordic countries, and we also do compare how these journals were interacting, how their editors were interacting, and we also have 2 cases from Spain and Germany, Britain, to put this into a broader perspective. I guess most of you have been here yesterday, so I don't need to repeat too much of what I already said yesterday. So we just start right away with Oula Silvennoinen's presentation. Glad to introduce him. He is a researcher and associate professor at the University of Helsinki and one of the leading experts on anti-Semitism, the Holocaust in Finland, the far right, fascism, well, you basically name it. He is also co-heading the Network of Nordic Fascism Studies together with me, which we slightly talked about yesterday, and we also, I think you will say a bit about it, we also just started a new research project last year called Inception, the Birth of Nordic Fashion, where also Lars is part of. So this special issue also is a product, a byproduct of the recent research project we've been working on. So I think the floor is yours. You know how to handle this?
I know well. Okay. This works. Thank you. Yes, you need to have the slides.
On the end of just have to find the PowerPoint. This is all yesterday, as you probably know.
Fast forward.
This is today. You have the program also in front of you, I hope. And I can stop.
Right. Thank you, Nicola. Good morning, everyone. I will be talking briefly about a publishing house that was active in Finland from 1930 to 1944. It's called Vasara. It means the hammer. You can see already where this is getting to. And about the people who, the rather tight-knit group of people who were behind this publishing house, and at the same time were the foremost pioneers of conspiracist anti-Semitism in Finland. The picture you see here is one of their publications, a journal called Siniristi, which means Blue Cross, and from the imagery you can see already the agenda of the journal. But this was maybe the main thing that the Vasara publishing house put forward until the end of the Second World War. But we shall have a brief look on also what else they did. How does this work? Here? No? Help. From here? This one? But it... Okay, yeah. No, that's fine. Yeah, great, thank you. Sorry for that. Nicola already mentioned the research project we are currently having under Uppsala University called the Birth of Nordic Fascism. In it we have tried to identify and follow individuals and also intellectual patterns that would precede the formation of recognizably fascist organizations and fascist thought in the Nordic countries. And I would say that one of such individuals you can see here, Rafael Lindqvist, a Swedish-speaking Finnish journalist, editor, novelist, poet, translator, a wide-ranging activist on the literary field. He's someone whose who's already active way before the Russian revolutions and the later turn towards Judeo-Bolshevism. But he's also an anti-Semite well before the Russian Revolution, and one of the leading proponents of anti-Semitism in Finland. In his publications, he constantly refers to anti-Semitic themes and publishes a lot of poems with anti-Semitic undertones, and publishes a satirical journal called Fyren, which is clearly also carries anti-Semitic articles quite a lot. But then when the Russian Empire collapses, his anti-Semitism really just only kicks into a higher gear. He's probably the first, or if not the very first, to translate the Protocols of the Elders of Zion into some other language outside Russia. His translation comes out in 1919 in Finland in the Swedish language, and is rapidly then translated into Finnish, and also new editions of it are taken in Sweden in Swedish. So this is one of the earliest examples of the protocols traveling outside Russia. Maybe even more important in regard of the theme of today, the Vasara Publishing House and the group around it, is that he is the father of Gunnar Lindqvist, a man born in 1898. Sorry. It wasn't that simple. Let's put this way. Right. Here you can see the major characters around the Vasara Publishing, later Vasara Publishing House. Gunnar Lindqvist is here. He's pictured in his later years in the uniform of the Finnish army during the Second World War. But don't let that deceive you. He used to be a dashing young man, just like Gunnar von Herzen here, who is pictured in 1917, probably on an undercover mission to Finland before Finnish independence. These people share a remarkably uniform set of background features. Almost all of them are Swedish speakers, but that doesn't seem to be a very crucial issue. What's more crucial is that the experience of war and organized violence seems to tie them up very much. Gunnar Lindqvist is a veteran of the Prussian Jäger battalion set up in Germany in 1915 to train Finnish volunteers for future military operations against the Russian Empire. Likewise, Gunnar von Herzen is one of the earliest members of the battalion. Toivo Karanko, man you can see here, is also another Jäger. And the experience with war in regard to these men doesn't end there. For beyond their service on the fronts of World War I and their experience in the ranks of the Jäger battalion in the Finnish Civil War, they continue their military careers also afterwards. Gunnar Lindqvist especially is a conspicuous example because immediately after the Finnish Civil War has been concluded in 1918, he goes to the Estonian War of Liberation, as many Finnish volunteers did, and from Estonia he transfers himself to the German Freikorps operating in the Baltic region under General Rüdiger von der Goltz. And with that, he ends up in Germany after the the end game of the World War has finally been played out in the Baltic region, and spends the whole 1920s in Germany, only to return to Finland in 1927. We'll come back to that shortly, but still there are two notable individuals of the Vasara-Circle. Yrjö Jalander, who is a chemist by background, a slightly older man. He lacks the kind of military background as like these others, but is a successful businessman already in the 1920s, and the key funder of the Vasara publishing house and the activities of the group. And then there is, of course, the vicar, Matti Jaakkola, pictured here in the 1950s or after the war, surrounded by his, well, I don't know who these people actually are, but let's say they are adoring him anyway. He's an interesting example of perhaps the most vitriolic anti-Semitic propagandist in Finland, who's very conscious with his work from the 1920s to until the very end of the war. And he also becomes one of the key members of the future Vasara-Circle. Throughout its existence, the Vasara publishing house is certainly not mainstream. That's not what I'm implying here. Their brand of anti-Semitism is in the margin. It's easy to see that they are trying to introduce it into wider circles in Finland. First into the general acceptance of the Finnish far right, and then to the wider public, with, I would say, rather limited success, but that's another story. Nevertheless, the idea of Judeo-Bolshevism, for example, that Paavo told us yesterday, can be seen taking hold very quickly on much wider circles of the Finnish society of the time. By late 1920, we have the then chief of the Finnish security police, Ossi Holmström, advising the members of his organization, the security police, that you should know that, according to the reports we've received, at least 80% of the Bolshevik leaders in Russia are Jews, and that's why you need to be extra careful with the Jews. And this is a feature that you can see becoming doctrine in the interwar Finnish security police, who start to take extra interest towards any and all Jews. You can see how this basically racist belief starts to actually have real-life effects in guiding the actions of an authority. But we go back to 1927 when Gunnar Lindqvist finally returns to Finland from Germany and enters into an environment where the far right really seems to be on an upswing. The late 1920s is a time of great it's an organizing period for the Finnish far right, culminating in the setting up in 1929 of the so-called Lapua movement, which becomes the most successful, the most influential Finnish far right mass organization. And it's this heady environment which also probably convinces these men that now is the time to strike. They set up the Vasara publishing house by 1930. They set up an organization, the Viitasaari Patriotic Club, around Gunnar von Herzen, who has taken up a position as a physician in the parish of Viitasaari, where Matti Jaakkola happens to be the local Lutheran minister. And they start really to try to first gain influence in the Lapua movement and export their interpretation of conspiracist antisemitism into the minds of the supporters of the movement. And they set up a journal called Tapparamies, which means a battle axe man, and is a precursor to the one I already showed you. And Tapparamies is single-mindedly anti-Semitic, anti-Masonic, and anti-communist in its outlook. There's not a shred of humor on its pages, but instead, well, maybe I will read you a short piece so that you get the idea. In one article, they managed to tell the readers that first of all, behind every subversive movement, you can find, quote, Jewish anti-Christian world revolutionary movement, unquote, which is now enclosing the entire globe in its iron embrace, as to say. This Jewish internationale would use as its tools a breathtaking array of different ideas. Anti-Christianity, unquoting, liberalism, socialism, communism, major newspapers, big business, closet masonry, Russellism, this is a reference to Bertrand Russell, I guess, film, which is a new industry at that time, nudity art, whatever that might mean, and women's frivolous dress, purposeful unemployment, etc., unquote. So the list doesn't end there, but say, in order to poison and putrefy all nations to pave the way for a final great collapse and the establishment of a Jewish anti-Christian world dominance over the ruins of Christendom, end of quote. So you can see that these people are already talking the language, and they have nothing to learn anymore from the continental anti-Semites. Gunnar von Herzen, in particular, aspires to the leadership of the Lapua movement, but is never quite so successful as he himself wishes to be. And as the heyday of the movement comes and passes quickly in the summer of 1930, the Lapua movement sinks into increasing irrelevance. But that doesn't mean that the Vasara group or the publishing house would cease their activities. Now, okay, I managed to do that. Their journal, they quickly they change its name, and it starts to appear under the title Siniristi. It has different slogans. Here it says that it's a battle journal for the fatherland, for the happiness of the people and the faith of the fathers. But it's an anti-Semitic, anti-Masonic, and anti-communist publication throughout. It also occasionally publishes material drawn from the Weltdienst, Nicola told you yesterday, even though it might be said that it doesn't extensively employ Weltdienst material. They seem to take that into their publication range when it suits them. There is never a Finnish language edition of the Weltdienst also, so outlets like Siniristi, which is a fringe journal, of course, with very low circulation, are the only outlets of Weltdienst material into Finland in the Finnish language. But there you can see also another feature of the group, that despite they are extensively Swedish speakers, some of them like Gunnar Lindqvist is really monolingual, they nevertheless have a consistent tendency to try to reach out to the Finnish-speaking population by publishing in Finnish, and also occasionally in Swedish, either in Finland or in Sweden. Yrjö Jalander is a great example of a man who is he has great connections in Sweden, and he also publishes in Swedish anti-Semitic journals his articles. But anyway, Nicola asked yesterday whether what might be the reason that there's never a Finnish language edition of the Weltdienst. I personally think that may be the fact that there isn't a Swedish language, Norwegian or Danish edition either until 1940 has to do with two things, mainly the occupation in the case of Norway and Denmark, and the second one is that Sweden has a prominent position in the hopes of, well, German propaganda as a potential ally and a potential supporter way into the war. And also, if you look at how German propaganda deals with Finland, they tend to be rather wary, because Finland is an ally, on the other hand, and you don't sort of target your ally with heavy propaganda. That's not courtesy. That's something else. With that, okay, we go past that. I will say a few words about the interwar and wartime major publishing houses and anti-Semitic and Nazi material in general in Finland. Well, publishing houses are businesses, and they usually, what they publish, they expect to make money off. And that's the reason why many key works of Nazi literature, like the novel Horst Wessel, which comes out in Germany in 1932, is very quickly translated into Finnish by a major publishing house, and such material in general reaches Finnish audiences very quickly. Then, of course, there's a great interest in the new Germany in the early 30s. What is this National Socialism? And the major publishing houses like Ottawa here, these are all Ottawa titles. It's still a functioning publishing house. They cater to that audience by publishing treatises explaining the German system and Hitler's new state. Then there are some staple anti-Semitic classics that also make it to the circulation through the major publishers like Henry Ford's The International Jew, which receives very quickly a Finnish translation in the 1920s. And lastly, during the war, you can see the tendency where, especially as long as there is a strong belief in the eventual German victory, that the major publishing houses, well, it's Ottawa again, they take up material directly from the press section of the German legation in Helsinki and have it translated and published in Finland. So the Finnish readers certainly are well catered by material that in no way does not try to hide the peculiarities of the Nazi ideology, but that the kind of conspiracist, most paranoid anti-Semitism is still left to fringe publishers like the, how much time do I have? 2 minutes. Okay, yeah. 8 minutes question. No one, this will be so thorough that no one will need to ask anything. Okay, I will come to the end, and then we skip this one as well. Maybe by the end of the war in 1944, for Finland, when Finland makes the armistice with the Soviet Union, that means the end of the Vasara publishing house and an open anti-Semitic publication that they had stood for. They are forced into the post-war silence, as so many Finnish National Socialists or fascists and other far-right sympathizers. But you can see that the Vasara publications have enjoyed in later decades a continuing niche influence among the far right. This is actually from another edition of the protocols that they published during the war. Here you can see the 1970s Finnish Nazi leader Pekka Siitoin, who, despite being very much a clownish character, still did a lot by publishing and republishing this kind of anti-Semitic material. Here, it's the pamphlet of actually of Martin Luther von der Juden Lügen, which was translated into Finnish by the Vasara publishing house and then republished and by Mr. Pekka Siitoin and his Nazi group in the 1970s. But I think in order to not to overstep my time limit, this is where I will end. Thank you very much. Just 1 minute for questions.
In the excitement of yesterday, we managed to lose the microphone. So we have to speak up and keep your question short, so everyone can have their answers. Yes?
As I said yesterday,
Good example of sound.
the effect of this literature on the Finnish population must have been quite small, considering that Marshal Mannerheim and the Finnish people did not allow the Jews to be deported during the war.
Well, yeah, I do think the impact of this kind of literature was very small, but as to what comes to the Jews and their deportations, I don't think the Marshal Mannerheim was ever asked to deport them, so that kind of leaves the point moot. That's the thing. Germany never officially requested the deportation of Finnish Jews, and already in the Wannsee Protocol from early 1942, the Finnish Jews were listed there as sort of to be dealt with later, but already at the time decision was taken that because they are such a small group, something like over 2,000 individuals in the German estimate, they can be left for later. And then, you're welcome.
Yes. Rather many Finnish soldiers joined the German side and also in Ukraine, for instance. And was it rather many that really wanted to support Germany?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, you're referring to the recruitment of Finnish SS volunteer battalion in early 1941. And yeah, sure. And you can see the sort of organizations of the Finnish far right very active in the recruitment process, so that the battalion came to consist of people mainly of far right persuasion, some of them outright National Socialists. And it's of course, the battalion, of course, was an environment where the volunteers would have been exposed to the full weight of Nazi propaganda, and that was the whole idea, that after the war they would return to Finland and be the new elite in a non-democratic Finland. That's clear. But they still represent a rather narrow section of the population at large. Thank you.
Do I need this? Yeah, perhaps. Yeah, the lack of microphone, I have to use this as well, like this. Our next speaker is Lars M. Andersson. Lars is a senior lecturer at the Department of History at the Uppsala University. Since 2013, he has also been the co-director of Forum for Jewish Studies at the Faculty of Theology. Lars has researched and published extensively mainly on Jewish history, refugee policy, and the history of anti-Semitism in Sweden. His doctoral thesis from 2000 actually analyzes the representation of the Jew in the Swedish satirical press from 1900 till 1930. In 2019, Lars also received the pedagogical prize of Uppsala University in the field of humanities, theology, and educational science. Lars is going to give a lecture on the anti-Semitic publication Hammaren that was published during the Second World War.
Så det baki der. Og peke på ting den ingen. Så må du ha denne her.
Fungerer, does it work like this? Everyone can hear? Thank you. I will rely on the tech support guy to my right here if I need to. So, as you can see, I'm going to talk about Hammaren, and I'm going to say a bit more about that journal in some time. And I'm discussing it as an example of conspiracist antisemitism. But what I'm really interested in is to try to show the kind of strategies employed by Hammaren to reveal these alleged Jewish world conspiracy. So the topic of my talk is actually how do you reveal a conspiracy? This is some examples of how Hammaren looked. And you can see, I will get back to the editors, but there is one of them was also a draftsman, the Swedish version of Ruprecht, or Phipps, who did all the drawings for Der Stürmer. His name is Carl Magnus Manneberg, and he's the draftsman of Swedish Nazism. He did all the covers and most of the illustrations in Hammaren. You can see different examples of this volume. It was published between 1943 and 1945. And according to their own figures, the circulation was roughly 10,000 copies, and it was published roughly monthly. I think that these figures are vastly exaggerated, but I think that still that there was a rather substantial circulation. So, one way to answer the kind of question, how do you reveal a world conspiracy or a world Jewish conspiracy? It is, of course, through imagery, using similes, metaphors, in different ways exposing the ones allegedly acting behind the scene, pulling the strings, the puppeteers, the octopuses, the vultures, and so on and so forth. And here are some contemporary examples. These are not from Hammaren. You can see it's Soros in some of the pictures as an octopus, as a puppeteer, and then you've got Prime Minister Netanyahu as another puppeteer, and here are also the different things that the Jews are accused of orchestrating, being responsible for, and being the puppeteers pulling the strings behind the scene. You can see that Netanyahu is given the responsibility for ISIS, for the Paris attacks in 2013, for the bombings in Syria in 2015, and so on. And you've got Soros pulling the strings of an Indian politician, also controlling Indian policy. And then you've got the Jews as responsible for COVID and all other things. And then the picture down to the left is a Jew selling everything that is bad in the world, basically. So this is, of course, one way, using imagery. The other way is, as we have heard many times these days, through forgeries. And here is the most famous of them all, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And most of them, as you can see, using the same kind of imagery as in the slides, or as in the previous slide. And I've tried to highlight the Swedish edition published in Finland in 1919, and then in 1920, 1924, in several different issues. But here are in all kinds of languages, just to give you a kind of example. Or you can do like this, and this is what Hammaren does. These are all examples from Hammaren. So this journal, as I said, it was published between 1943 and 1945. They combined all these different kinds of things. They used a lot of imagery, as you could see in the first slide. They used the Protocols of the Elders of Science and other anti-Semitic forgeries, and combined this imagery, essays, theology. They also produced and reproduced Martin Luther's about the Jews and their lies, as Oula just mentioned, and history writing, different kind of histories of different things that was bad, always associated with Jews, and basically using every single journalistic genre under the sun to convey this image that there is a world conspiracy and that the Jews are controlling everything. So during this period for 2.5 years, the journal did not contain one single article not attacking Jews and Judaism in history and or in contemporary society. And as I said at the introduction, in the following, I will focus on the strategies used to enlighten the Swedes about the danger, the imminent danger that the Jews pose to them by exposing the Jews. But first, I need to say something about conspiracism and about the journal. As Kjetil mentioned yesterday, an important idea in conspiracist thinking in general and in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories in particular is that the fight against the alleged conspirators is an act of self-defense. It's an uphill battle against an all-powerful enemy who is the actual aggressor. Thus, the anti-Semites claim victimhood. They are the true victims. Another key feature is the sense of urgency. It is always 5 to 12. It's the last wake-up call for the people. And this sense of urgency and the idea that anti-Semitism is a form of self-defense, they are defining features of Hammaren, which was and still is the most venomous Swedish anti-Semitic journal. And it was inspired both by Theodor Fritsch, Der Hammer, by Julius Streicher's Der Stürmer, but also by Swedish anti-Semitic traditions going way back to the 18th century. And it was published by the most radical Swedish National Socialists at the time, some of the more prominent members of the Lindholm movement. There were two larger National Socialist movements in Sweden, the Furugård movements and the Lindholm movements, named after their leaders. And the Lindholm movement was the more radical one. And it's the most radical and also the leading and most prominent intellectuals in the Lindholm movement who published Hammaren. A couple of them had PhDs, for instance, and they were prominent journalists, publicists, and so on and so forth. I'm just going to mention two. Carl Magnus Mannerberg, I mentioned before, he is the draftsman of Swedish National Socialism, and he worked for the Lindholm movement's mouthpieces from the 1930s and onwards. And he then, after the war, continued publishing new journals, Fri Press, Kretsnytt, and others, and was an active anti-Semite until the 1970s. The other one is Einar Åberg, who's probably the most prominent or notorious Swedish anti-Semite, and also the best known internationally. He's the person for whom we should be grateful in one way, because he was the one whose activities resulted in Sweden getting legislation against hate crimes in 1948, sometimes referred to as Lex Åberg. And we had that because there were protests from a lot of other countries, Costa Rica and elsewhere, objecting to his disseminating anti-Semitic propaganda and Holocaust denial from very early on, from 1945 and onwards. And he was also active until the late 1960s, early 1970s. And Åberg is still today a very prominent figure in Swedish National Socialism, and there is a stipend in his memory, and so on and so forth. So, and Berg and Åberg, like many other anti-Semites before them and after, they defined their task as an all-important enlightenment project, designed to, before it was too late, make the Swedish people aware that they were living under the boot of the Jews. And it's also important to note that they found very eager helpers in the Swedish public. There is, fortunately, a huge archive from the Swedish intelligence organizations, and they tapped the phones and they opened the letters sent to the editors and to the journal. So we can follow in detail which kind of articles that were based on material submitted or sent in by the readers. So it's you can actually just dive into the rabbit hole and follow and end up in the anti-Semitic milieu, the most radical anti-Semitic milieu in Sweden in 1943 to 1945. So, these are the strategies that Hammaren employed. So one of the key things was to map and identify. And they did that by listing Jews in various professions. Who are the Jews in banking? Who are the Jews in journalism? Which businesses are owned by Jews in Gothenburg, in Stockholm, and so on and so forth. And they also published lists of Jews who had changed their names to more Swedish sounding or more German sounding names in order to ensure that they should not be able to pass as Swedes. And these lists were published throughout the existence of the journal, and even in the last issue in April 1945, there was an addition, a new Jewish companies in Gothenburg, for instance. So this was an important part, and this was also something that the Lindholm movement was very much involved in, and Manneberg had done that before, and many prior to him. One of the more prominent Swedish anti-Semites, Elof Eriksson, also did that, inspired by German anti-Semites. He published a book about who are the Jews in Swedish aristocracy, called Semigota. So this was a thing all anti-Semites did, not only in Sweden, but it was a prominent thing, identifying and mapping who the Jews were. And then another thing was to find and name the alleged Jewish culprits. And that included blaming and naming Jews, suspected, accused, and sometimes sentenced for various crimes. If there was a trial somewhere in Sweden regarding something that might involve a Jew or a person with a Jewish-sounding name, that was published in Hammaren in order to show, look, the Jews are always, they're criminals, they do this and that thing. And here they also focused quite heavily on the Jewish refugees living in Sweden from Norway and from Denmark. So everything that had to do with Jewish refugees from Norway and Denmark was reported on. If someone had, well, basically run a red light or something like that, that was blown up, and it was a big article on these kind of things. And that was also based on information submitted by the readers to a large extent. And then, of course, we heard yesterday about the ideas about some kind of Jewish spirit that could affect everyone who was also a non-Jew. And of course, one of the key things done in Hammaren is to identify the traitors. The Swedes, the majority Swedes or ethnic Swedes, who were seen as collaborators and also as advocates of the Jews, and people engaged to or married to Jews. There were, for instance, lists published with people engaged to be married to Jews, and they were thus blamed and shamed in that way. But they also published articles where they gave prominent Swedes the medal pour le Semite, which is of course a parody, a mockery of pour le Mérite, which is a famous order, but this one was in a blue and white ribbon and with a Star of David that was to be carried outside of your clothes. So this is, of course, a reference to the Stars of David worn by Jews in Nazi-occupied Europe and in Germany. And this was to single out the alleged traitors to the cause of the Swedish people. And it was primarily given to prominent political opponents, to people wanting to ban Nazi organizations, to people wanting to advocating legislation against hate crime and so on and so forth. Most of them were social democratic or liberal politicians that were attacked in this way. So that was also important to identify the ones who were Jews in spirit, so to speak, the ones who betrayed their own Swedish people. And then a very important strategy was to promote negative descriptions of Jews and Judaism, of Jewish traditions. I mean, this is in the tradition of the Talmud Juda and all these other kind of books that had been published already from the 18th century and onwards, describing Judaism as a very negative religion in many different ways, showing the role of Jews, the alleged negative role of Jews in history, in different traditions and so on and so forth, and also in contemporary society. And the point here, of course, is to show that people everywhere, in the United States, in Poland, in Germany, in Latin America, they hate the Jews. This is not only us, we are part of a large tradition of Jew hating, and we hate the Jews because of what they do. It's not because we're anti-Semites, it's because of what Jews do everywhere. So that's why they've got these kind of histories and the examples from all over the world. And then finally, there is the republishing of anti-Semitic classics. I mentioned about the Jews and the Lies by Martin Luther, but they also publish extensively from their predecessors in the anti-Semitic traditions like Theodor Fritsch and others. So that's one of the things. But it's also lots of quotes, so to speak, from the horse's mouths, from Jews saying bad things about Judaism or twisting things that Jews say to show that, well, the Jews started the war, they are responsible for the ongoing world war, or whatever that might be. And then, of course, from Gentiles and from other anti-Semites not liking the Jews. And this is also a strategy employed to reveal what the Jews are really like. It's about revelation of the truths about the Jews, and also to show that people have always, throughout history, hated Jews. Not only that people have hated Jews everywhere, but also from the very beginning, people have hated Jews. So this is a way of showing that this is really bad. We need to do something. So this is the kind of Enlightenment project that Hammaren engages in. How much time do I have, Nicola? 3 minutes, okay. I will also end by saying something about how this kind of anti-Semitism that you find in Hammaren is related to mainstream, everyday, traditional anti-Semitism. And I will give you one example. In Hammaren, they publish caricatures, the rather bad ones, by Manneberg, but they also publish caricatures previously published in the liberal, conservative, socialist comics, published in the early 1900s and 1910, 20, that then completely vanished. They stopped publishing these kind of caricatures when Nazism became a thing, because they realized this is not good. It could be published in the 1910s and 1920s, and then it vanished. And it was also replaced in the case that Jews were depicted, that they used another stereotype, the Jew as Ahasverus, the wandering Jew not allowed in anywhere, kept out from all the European countries. So they couldn't use the kind of traditional anti-Semitic capitalist stereotype. So instead they used the other ones to convey the image of the Jews as a victim. However, these kind of caricatures now reappear, the older ones. They were rehashed and used regularly in Hammaren. So it's a new context, it's the same kind of pictures, they convey exactly the same kind of message, but they had become impossible in a liberal, social democratic, conservative context, but were now used here. So it's not actually about the content, the difference between some kind of everyday anti-Semitism and this kind of propagandistic, conspiracist anti-Semitism. It's about hatred. It's about the fact that there are no other pictures whatsoever, and it's about the kind of intensity used in these kind of cases. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you. Questions?
Thank you very much. Do we have some questions?
Yes, Lisa.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. Both you and others have mentioned these publications, so to speak, naming and shaming Jews. And of course, you're studying the publication side of this, but have you come across anything about how this was experienced by these people themselves who were making these very radical publications? How they reacted to these practices?
I mean, there were some examples of especially Swedish Jews protesting. One of the most famous examples is Isak Grünewald, the famous modernist artist. And he was attacked already in the 1910s by traditional or mainstream media using anti-Semitic tropes and things like that. But he was also vehemently attacked, especially in Hammaren, because he was an old classmate of Einar Öberg, and they had been in a fight. There was a fist fight outside of a bookshop run by Einar Öberg when Öberg was working there as a sandwich man with anti-Semitic propaganda on, well, basically on his stomach. And there was a fight, and there was a trial, and Öberg was sentenced, and Grünewald was not, and this upset Hammaren very much. So that's one example. Another example is Marcus Ehrenpreis, who protested in different contexts, and also took part in the trial when the protocols of the Elders of Zion were shown to be a forgery, because Einar Öberg had written a preface where he forged parts of a talk given by Ehrenpreis, and that was published as a preface to the protocol. So he was also involved there. So there were things going on from the Swedish Jews to protest against these kind of things. So that would be one example.
Is it possible to say something about the effect on the Hammaren had on the Swedish people? Was it just the small ring there?
I think, I mean, this is, as Oula said, this is also kind of lunatic fringe in a way. But it is also disseminated in rather large numbers, although it's not 10,000 copies. It was circulated in substantial numbers. And the interesting thing here is that we've got all these kind of people, and all of them are publishers, all of them have publishing houses. You might have seen that there was an ad for Argus, which was Wilhelm Wiljekrantz, a baron, who published lots of pamphlets that were then rehashed and republished in Hammaren. So there was, I mean, this was disseminated everywhere, and I think it did affect people, because they would encounter these kind of things everywhere. And of course, there was also this traditional or mainstream anti-Semitism that had not, of course, disappeared into thin air. So there was these kind of ideas about what Jews were, who they were, what they were like. And since there are so many similarities also between the traditional anti-Semitism and the kind of conspiracist anti-Semitism, I think that it also had an effect. But there was also, of course, these kind of rather strong protests against anti-Semitism. I mean, the Swedish labor movement, they had the 1st of May manifestations. One of them was specifically against anti-Semitism. So there was also lots of protest. But I think it had an effect. And I especially think it had an effect and made anti-Semitism survive. Because these people continued, they had even more marginal journals and publication projects after the war, but they continued until the 1970s. And then the baton was taken over by the skinheads coming in the 80s, in the 90s, and they were in contact. So there is a continuity from these people who were active from the 1920s and 30s and until the ones who are active today, and the roots of the Sweden Democrats, for instance. many of them can trace their ancestry all the way back to these.
Thank you for the very interesting lecture. Can you tell us something, to your knowledge? How did this anti-Semitic information, did it have any effect as to the fact that a great number of Norwegian Jews escaped to Sweden, lived there for a number of years during the war? Do you know anything about how the Swedish population dealt with the problem of this Hammaren's publications and what they said? Did it have any effect on their behavior towards this little group of Swedish and of Norwegian and Danish refugees, the Jewish ones, whilst they were living in Sweden?
I really don't know. I don't think it had any large impact. But of course, I mean, if let's put it this way: in the case that Norwegian and Danish Jewish refugees encounter these kind of propaganda, it would of course have made them extremely anxious. And since there was a lot of these kind of propaganda around, I think it affected Norwegian and Danish Jews in that sense, making them feel less secure, and so on and so forth. That I think, but I haven't got any kind of evidence of it.
Less secure and less welcome.
Yes, yeah.
I have a question with regards to the point one mapping and identifying. How true was it? Yesterday we heard about how the Finnish press portrayed, for example, Domination as Jewish. In the Norwegian conservative press, in the mainstream press, Paavo was named as a Jew who was not. How was this in Hammaren? Were they exact lists or were they falsifications?
No, and they made a lot of mistakes, and that was embarrassing. And that's, I mean, there are lots of examples of that. So they publish this and say, this is a Jewish company, the owner is a Jew, and so on. And in the next issue, they had to rectify that and say, oh, sorry, we were wrong. He's not actually, because then the person who owned the shop had protested and said, I'm not Jewish, you have to retract. And they did, and they said, sorry about this. But that's, what they basically said was, well, this is collateral damage in the struggle, and true Swedes will understand that we will make some mistakes, but we are of course very, very sorry, he is not Jewish. Yeah.
But did they willfully include people who were not Jewish in their list?
I have not checked in any detail, but I'm quite sure that they got, I mean, for instance, the name Levin in Swedish is most often not a Jewish name. And I'm quite sure that there were many Levins in the lists who were not Jews. So I think that, I mean, they made mistakes all the time. And of course, the people reporting and sending in this kind of information to the journal, they would say, well, this is a Jew. And they might do it because they hated their neighbor or they were rivals in business or whatever they were. And as far as I can tell, Hammaren was not interested in that because they wanted the lists and they wanted to. But they also, I mean, they also needed to have some kind of accuracy in that sense. Yeah.
I'm fascinated by the fact that Jew hatred's age. I mean, the fact that it's old is a proof of its truth, which is something we see
Yeah.
today. Rather, it's hard to sort of fight against because it is old. But in some of these environments, the traitors are even worse than the, I don't know, the masterminds or the Jews themselves. As you can see in Breivik, for instance, he was going after the traitors. Would that be the case in this sort of?
I would think, I think they really hated the alleged traitors, but I think they hated the Jews even more in this context. But I mean, equally bad. Yeah.
One last question from me before lunch, although Elise sort of stole parts of it. But coming back to Norwegian refugees, Jewish refugees in Sweden during the war, I've looked into anti-Semitism from the Norwegian exile community, not so much from the Swedish society. But when I looked into it many years ago, it looks like it was much more prevalent, or I found much more examples of anti-Semitism towards Danish Jews who came 1 year later. Of course, there were sevenfold many. But have you seen that? Is it more towards the Danes, or have you found many examples of anti-Semitism or writing about the threat of Norwegian Jews coming to Sweden in Hammaren?
There is it is described as a threat already in 1942, when the first Jewish refugees are arriving, and it's described as a flood. They're flooding Sweden, and the numbers are, of course, vastly exaggerated. But then, the big campaigns, they are against the arrival of the Danish Jews. There is a huge campaign run by the Lindholm movement called Stop Moses at the Gate. So yes, I think and I think it's got to do with numbers, but I also think it's got to do with they are aware that the opinions are shifting in favor of reception of refugees.
After all, they were Danes. After all, they were Danes as well. Yeah, and Swedish and Danes don't go that well. That's the explanation. Okay.
Yeah, might be the case. Yeah.
That's true. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now we'll start circulating one by one to take lunch. And we come back after lunch.
I'm very delighted to introduce our colleague Sophie Lene Bach. She is an associate professor at the Copenhagen University at the History Department, and she has done research on Holocaust, anti-Semitism, and remembrance culture in Denmark for, I think I can say, decades by now. She's one of the leading experts in this field, has also participated and being part in producing TV documentations, for example, on the topic, and she has also been the research leader at the Jewish Museum in Denmark earlier. She is also a member of Norfars and part of the steering committee, which means that we also very closely work with her on anti-Semitism and fascism studies. So she's in these fields too.
The benefits of combining research on conspiracy theories and the acknowledgement from anti-Semitism studies is that it may further our understanding of the mechanism of anti-Semitism. And by the way, the other way around, that anti-Semitism studies may further our understanding of how conspiracy theories work. Because while the concept of race and biological racism was compromised after the Second World War, conspiracy theories and conspiracy beliefs have remained a constant within anti-Semitic movements and platforms, though often concealed behind codes and euphemisms. What I will demonstrate is how generic theories on anti-Semitism, when combined with concepts from research on conspiracy beliefs, not only explains why conspiracists are prone to adopt anti-Semitic tropes and codes, but also the reverse process. Why conspiracy beliefs are adapted in milieus that are already infected with anti-Semitism. In the modern classic towards the definition of anti-Semitism from 1990, the medieval historian Gavin Langmuir presents a generic theory which understands anti-Semitism as a form of communication, and then focuses on the logic of argumentation in anti-Semitic statements, and these statements' implicit functions, intentions, and consequences. Central to Langmuir's theory is an analytical distinction between xenophobic, that is the ascription of a socially threatening behavior to Jews in general, and a chimeric form of hostility, referring to behavior and traits that have never been empirically observed and have no connection to reality. They may either refer to a perceived consciously secret conspiracy, the conspiracy of the Jewish world, of the Jewish world conspiracy, or to an unconscious biological conspiracy, the illusion of the Jewish anti-race. However, Langmuir elaborated very little on the features of the chimeric hostility category. Explicitly, he refers to National Socialist anti-Semitism as an example of chimeric hostility. However, his statements are not further substantiated empirically, and it remains obscure which features in National Socialist antisemitism determine its placement in the chimeric category. To distinguish between different kinds of chimeric arguments, I have developed the following visualization. Chimeric illusions may include, but are not limited to, what we could call Manichaeism or demonization, that is, a radical dualism that perceives Jews as the representatives of darkness and evil. It may include dehumanization, that is, depriving Jews of human qualities and excluding them from the universal human community. It may include racism, and it may include conspiracism. Racism here is understood as denoting biological racism, that is, ascribing demeaning physical and mental characteristics to a group of people designated as a biological entity, a race. Yet the common features of this type of chimeric hostility is an argumentative logic which relies on stigmatized knowledge, a term originating from sociologist and expert on conspiracy theories, Michael Barkun. Stigmatized knowledge is defined as claims to truth that the claimants regard as verified despite the marginalization of those claims by the institutions that conventionally distinguish between knowledge and error, that is, universities, communities of scientific researchers, and the like. By applying concepts from Michael Barkun, radical anti-Semitic milieus can be explored as realms of stigmatized knowledge, prone to conspiracy beliefs, just as concepts such as the dynamic of expansion, from event conspiracies to systemic conspiracism, can be perceived as an anti-Semitic escalation process. That is, moving from event to systemic conspiracies, from a limited purpose to a grand scope, the more the conspiracy theory seeks to explain, the larger its domain of evil. Conspiracists are tempted by the mother of all conspiracies, the anti-Semitic claim of an imminent Jewish world takeover. While not all conspiracies are inherently anti-Semitic, the probability of incorporating anti-Semitic trope is eminent due to this dynamic. Yet what we are dealing with here is the reverse process, the adaptation of conspiracy beliefs in milieus already infected with anti-Semitism. In such circumstances, the dynamic of expansion may refer to adopting and incorporating stigmatized knowledge and sources of information and accumulating anti-Semitic tropes and stereotypes. And then it designates an anti-Semitic escalation process, a phenomenon already observable in internet and social media forums of contemporary society. So I decided to try to determine whether conspiracism is an inseparable and integrated part of anti-Semitism as perceived by National Socialists, or rather a marginalized extremist position even within National Socialist milieus. In addition, I have explored the possibility of identifying a spectrum of conspiracism. Is it conceivable to distinguish empirically between National Socialist texts which implement conspiracist ideas and references, and a conspiracist mindset in which all other ideological features are subordinated to systemic conspiracy? These relations between conspiracism and National Socialist antisemitism is explored through a systematic analysis of two Danish National Socialist journals. An investigation of the use of stigmatized knowledge and sources for information in the anti-Semitic journal Kamptegnet, which we might translate to the battle signal, which was already prone to conspiracist anti-Semitism. And on the other hand, the role of conspiracist beliefs in the weekly journal Nationalsocialisten, published by the largest Danish National Socialist Party, Danmarks Nationalsocialistiske Arbejderparti, or DNSAP. To those of you who are not intimately familiar with Danish National Socialism, a little elaboration on the relationship between the two parties is needed. The editor and publisher of Kamptegnet was actually excluded from the DNSAP due to his extreme opinions. In practice, his devoted dissemination of the literary forgery, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. H. Andersson then had joined the ranks of DNSAP in 1934, but his political ascent within the party ended just a year later. A catalyzing factor was a pamphlet published by Andersson earlier that same year, which revived the anti-Jewish ideas of Martin Luther with the conspiracist framework of the Protocols. Andersson's pamphlet generated considerable controversy in the mainstream press, which uniformly condemned it as a racist smear and ridiculed the use of a text that had already been exposed as a forgery in the early 1920s. The leaders of the DNSAP was afraid of the harm that this might do to the party's reputation, as they sought to attract support by de-emphasizing anti-Semitism. DNSAP even forbade party members from selling or distributing the pamphlet. Andersson then established his own party, the National Socialist Workers' Party, or Nationalsocialistisk Arbejderparti. Beware of the abbreviations here. And since his hands was no longer tied, he republished the Protocols in Danish in 1940 and 1941. Subsequent Danish edition from 1986 and 2017 are reprints of the 1940 version. In 1939, Andersson commenced the publication of the weekly journal Kamptegnet, a Danish counterpart to Julius Streicher's Der Stürmer. Remaining true to the original in terms of extremism, personal persecution, and the tabloid style of Der Stürmer, Kamptegnet excessively focuses on crime and sex. As a response to the hypersexual tone in the journal, the Danish Justice Department repeatedly contemplated banning Kamptegnet, citing the Danish law against pornography. Yet, it was not the racism or the sexualized, mocking and scornful rhetoric of H. Andersson's propaganda which prompted Denmark's National Socialist Workers' Party to stand back. Instead, it was the conspiracism that completely dominated Andersson's agenda. The disagreement may have been primarily tactical, yet it also reflected different views on the use of stigmatized knowledge, such as references to the Protocols. Although the NSAP and NSAP separated in 1935, they merged again in 1941 during the German occupation of Denmark. The ideological differences were not profound enough to prevent the parties from collaborating at a time when both were supported by the occupation forces, and the opportunistic mood in the larger segments of the population provided new recruitment potential. As the war progressed, the conspiracism of Kamptegnet took on an increasingly paranoid, apocalyptic, and redemptive tone, supported by the incorporation of additional stigmatized knowledge, such as the anti-Freemason conspiracy theories and another anti-Semitic phantom, the ritual murder accusation, or the myth of blood libel. Kamptegnet undertook an anti-Semitic escalation process through a dynamic of expansion, incorporating an increasing volume of conspiracist topoi and stigmatized knowledge of obscure and occult origin. The escalation is likely conditioned both by a closer formal and actual collaboration with the Stürmer and by the conductors of the ongoing war. It is highly coincidental that both the anti-Masonic and the ritual murder themes emerged in Kamptegnet just months after the German invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, and an intensified German propaganda effort which exploited conspiracist and apocalyptic themes following the invasion. Meanwhile, although conspiracist anti-Semitism was not absent in Nationalsocialism, it mainly persisted as a subtle, unreflected references such as to the system or to Jewish power or to the international Jewish high finance. This pattern remained relatively stable in the journal as a whole, even though the eventual integration of Kampteil into Nationalsocialism in 1943 meant that the journal embarked on an anti-Semitic escalation route. Most prominently, this meant adopting the association between Freemasonry and Jews, along with conspiracy themes related to anti-British and anti-American agenda. Conspiracist anti-Semitism was far from mainstream in Danish National Socialism, as represented at least by the DNSAP. It was an embarrassment and a liability until tactics and propaganda changed with the condition of the war. On average, 10% of Nationalsocialists' issues were infected with explicit conspiracism. This observation may possibly have a particular national explanation stemming from Denmark's geopolitical status and vulnerability to accusations of German influence, which could lead the NSAP to downplay aspects of National Socialism that enjoyed significant promotion in Germany. Antisemitism was never absent from the party's propaganda, yet it primarily appealed to xenophobic and racist prejudice also pervaded within the broader population. In Denmark, conspiracism remained an extremist position even within the National Socialist milieu. However, following the German occupation in 1940, another tactical consideration emerged. One focused on positioning the party as a viable alternative to the democratically elected government. This required a consolidation of National Socialist forces in Denmark and a readiness to develop plans for the persecution of Danish Jews, just as it allowed for radicalization in Nationalsocialism. Kampteil, on the other hand, never sought popular support or parliamentary representation. Their objective was an apocalyptic struggle for survival. With society already on the brink of disaster, only radical redemption would suffice, rendering all tactical consideration betrayal. In conclusion, using National Socialist journals to explore the prevalence and character of conspiracist antisemitism has proven methodologically fruitful, as it allows the identification of conspiracist themes, stigmatized knowledge, and anti-Semitic escalation. The historical case illuminates the importance of public discourse and the role of epistemic authorities, mainstream media, and political institutions in addressing the use of stigmatized knowledge and anti-Semitic fantasies. As groups seeking public support and political representation were ambivalent towards stigmatized knowledge, and hopefully they still are. Additionally, it is possible to observe differences between explicit and implicit conspiracism, with the latter working through codes and references. These may function as a means of strengthening cohesion within the milieu and signalizing ideological affiliation. In Nationalsocialism, such fragmented conspiracism was obviously connected to a coherent anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. However, the same phrases and references can move outside these particular environments and become part of the anti-Semitic cultural heritage without new users being aware of the conspiracist framework that they are engaging in. This process is currently increasingly evident in the use of conspiracist themes in the anti-Israeli protests following the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. And it underscores the urgent need for studies that combine anti-Semitism studies with research on conspiracy theories and ideologies. Thank you so much for your attention. Yeah, det kan jeg.
Thank you very much, and please excuse the technical difficulties in the start. Are there any questions to Sophie here now?
Not, can you stop sharing? If she stops sharing,
the PowerPoint.
Okay.
Then you can see her better.
Could you just widen the picture of Sophia? She must have.
No, she has to.
Could you stop sharing so we could just
Yes,
see
hello.
there? Yes, hello.
Yeah.
Okay. Are there any questions for Sophia? Please. I think this group is tired now after a long day.
Yeah, I would imagine. It's not. It really is not the same. I mean, I would have loved to be there with you. I mean, it is something different. I mean, I'm glad still that I could talk to you, but dialogue is difficult in via this technology. So I understand that you're tired.
Okay, we have one. Okay, we have two actually. Just a second.
Thank you very much. My name is Karcher. My mother was Danish and I'm connected to Denmark. And I was wondering what happened after the Danish Jews fled to Sweden. Was there any difference, or did they see this as a sign of victory over the Judeos, etc., etc.? What happened in the papers after the flight of the Danish Jews? Thank you.
Thank you. Good question. And it's really interesting that what happened at first, at least in the days and weeks after the persecution of the Jews in the beginning of October 1943, was silence. Nationalsocialism nor Kampfteil, they didn't report on the persecution. They didn't report on the flight to Sweden. They didn't report at all. And then suddenly the tone shifted. At least in Kampfteil, or in the publication of Oula Andersson, who was the most radical of the two, he started talking about that now the circumstances were right for a more positive racism or more positive eugenics. That now you could establish a focus on trying to improve the racial quality of the Danish population. And obviously, the condition for talking about positive eugenics was that the Jews were gone, that they had been driven out of Denmark. But the really weird thing is, as you read through the pages of October or November or December 1943, there's no mention of this allegedly success. At least the leader of the occupation forces in Denmark, Dr. Werner Best, as he declared towards Berlin, was that now Denmark was Judenrein, cleansed of Jews, because most had managed to flee to Sweden, and only a minority had been deported. But Denmark, in fact, was Judenrein, and you would suppose that this was the victory for the Danish National Socialists. But they felt obviously really uncomfortable with the issue, and they felt really uncomfortable with the fact that the Danish population as a whole had supported the Jews and had supported their flight to Sweden. So it was really strange that you had this long period of silence and then this certain shift towards the talk about positive eugenics and improving the racial quality of the Danish population. Really weird.
Thank you. I'd just like to follow up that. We heard in the past lecture about sort of traitors. If you so would the Danish population, they looked upon the Jews as it is said in the book as the landsmen. They took care of their properties. They didn't rob them. They didn't take their belongings. So did the National Socialists have anything to say about the Danish population that took care of the Jewish properties instead of robbing them? Do they look upon them as traitors to the good cause or something like that? Thank you.
I'm sure that they would have felt that the Danish population as such were traitors to the cause, or traitors to the anti-Semitic cause, but they didn't write about it. They started writing about the fact that the Danish Jews was now in Sweden because they still used conspiracy theories and conspiracist topoi about Jews controlling the scene in Denmark now from abroad, now from Sweden. So they did acknowledge the fact that the Danish Jews was in Sweden, but they did not publicly speak about the actions of the Danes. So it's one of those silences that are really loud, because it's so strange that it's absent. Because you would, as you suggest, you would expect them to condemn what Danes had done for the Jews, not just during the rescue, but also afterwards. But they just didn't. And obviously it was an uncomfortable issue for them. But there was no mention in the National Socialist press, and that also goes for the daily newspaper Fædrelandet, which also did not comment on the rescue, and they did not comment on the actions of the Danes. So it's a really loud silence.
Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes. My name is Dag Erensjø, and I have a question. I didn't hear it yesterday and not today. All we hear is what the National Socialist was describing about Jews. To me, it sounds like fairy tales. It surely was not a nice fairy tale, but all the stories about Jews arranging a plot for ruling the world and take over the economy and so forth. In my mind, I guess that the Jews themselves could not defend these accusations at all. I can take, for example, if you have two countries and there is a dispute between two countries, the ambassador of the first country can defend an accusation, or they can have a conversation between them. But in the case of the pre-war accusation towards the Jews, what can you tell me? Is there examples that the Jews raised up and tried to defend themselves? Because in my mind, this accusation was had no substance. It was accusation from thin air. Can you tell me, was there Jews that tried to defend all the accusations in this regard?
Yeah, thank you. Good question. I totally agree with you, and I've started using the term anti-Semitic fantasies, because that's really what they are. And if you want to try to address a larger audience and try to make them understand what conspiracism is or what conspiracy theories is, it might be easier to refer to them as anti-Semitic fantasies. So you're quite right. The answer is whether there were Jewish agents that somehow tried to stand up or try to address the conspiracy theories or these anti-Semitic fantasies. The answer is yes and no, because obviously Jews all over Europe in the 30s was really vulnerable, and they were vulnerable as to standing up in public and being publicly known as Jews. That's one part. But also being criticized not only by National Socialists, but also by larger parts of the population for defending minority rights or trying to somehow create an exclusiveness or protect the Jewish community from criticism. So they were really vulnerable in many ways in the interwar years. But luckily, they had ambassadors, to use your language. They had quite many ambassadors in Danish societies. among the clergy, among priests, among members of the press, and among politicians. And quite interestingly, in Denmark, they were also tried by the Danish Justice Department several times in the 1930s in Denmark. And they succeeded, the Justice Department, in actually sending the most fanatic group of antisemitics to jail in the 30s. And then, as you might say, the jewel in the crown, in 1993, Denmark had a racism clause implemented. I think it's the first racism clause at all in Europe. I'm not so familiar with aspects outside of Europe, but I think it's the first racism clause that actually forbade anti-Semitism and racism in public discourse. But it was implemented just months before the German invasion of Denmark, so it had no practical consequences before the war, but it was used during the war. The Justice Department did try to stop the anti-Semitic propaganda by referring to the racism clause, and after the war, this group of radical anti-Semitics were actually given a longer sentence because you could refer to that racism and anti-Semitism was already forbidden in Denmark, and that law predated the war. So they were actually sentenced to longer periods of jail because of the racism law. And that same clause still exists today. Now it has been revised several times, but in essence, it's the same clause as the one from 1939. And interestingly enough, to return to the anti-Semitic fantasies, the original clause did actually explicitly state that it should be statements that were not empirically could not be proved empirically. So it had this reference to the fantasies, to those arguments, images, topois, references that has no reference to reality. So, and later on, we have forgotten that this was actually a focus of the politicians and members of the press in the interwar year, that the difficulties of defending yourself and defending Jews against accusations that were not real. Because how can you disprove a claim that's not real? It's really, really difficult because if there is no proof, you cannot disprove it. So that made the discussion really difficult, and they actually had an eye for that in the interwar year. So thank you for that question.
Super. We just had to warm up the audience because now the questions are in the Netherlands. So.
Thank you for your presentation. I unfortunately missed the beginning of it because of the meeting, but I'm looking very much forward to reading your article. And I also very much enjoyed reading the previous article of yours on restitution in Denmark, as I'm writing my PhD in restitution in Norway myself. And in that regard, my question is very much on the side of your presentation today, which is I've been trying to get my hands on a book of yours that came up for me, and it's sold out, which congratulations, I guess. But is there any way of getting hold of this book? Because I really want to read it.
I think actually that you can buy it as an ebook. Because it still sells, but it only sells as an ebook. But and you should go to the publisher Gyldendal, and they should sell it on their webpage. But if you fail, write me an email and we'll figure something out.
Thank you very much for your great presentation and your article as well in the special issue. I just have a short comparative note about regarding the description of the deportation and arrests and deportations of Jews regarding Norway. Also, even in Norway, the National Socialists didn't, although the Christian Party was obviously conspiracist to the bone. I mean, conspiracist anti-Semitism was a core element of the rhetoric, so MS during the war. Still, neither of them described the much more successful, so to speak, deportations from Norway openly. They used all kind of metaphors. They called them protective measures. While the economic liquidation of Jewish property was one thing they openly bragged about. They even wrote editorials about that, but not the deportations and not the arrests, with one exception, an internal magazine called Hidspeile that wrote explicitly about the deportations of children, for example. But that was meant to be read by internally, in fact. So it's interesting, this what you mentioned here, this mixture of euphemisms and threatful language, in a sense. I think it's just more a comment than a question, but yeah.
Yeah, but thank you so much, Kjetil.
Thank you very much. One question for me, I think you sort of was talking a little bit about it a couple of questions ago, but both within the Norwegian exile community in Sweden and the Danish exile community in Sweden, there were anti-Jewish sentiments, and some of them, at least in the Norwegian context, ended up also in Norwegian Nazi newspapers. I mean, the conspiracy theories about Norwegian Jews in Sweden running the Norwegian legation and everything. But in Denmark, at least right after the Jews had escaped to Denmark, the Danish Jews were, more than 50% of the Danish exile community, and the leader of the Danish legation was Jewish. So was it the conspiracy theories about the Jews running the show in Sweden, was that the core element of what was written within the Nazi papers in Denmark?
I don't really think that such specific information came into the hands of National Socialist papers and journals in Denmark. I don't think they even knew that the legation was actually driven by a Jew. So what they were most interested in is ways that Jews that were in Sweden could still control affairs in Denmark. They weren't that preoccupied with what happened in Sweden, but rather how the Jews were still controlling the scene in Denmark. But what I actually thought you was going to ask me about, and that's a question that I really want to answer as well, so I'll just do that, is whether there were anti-Semitism in Sweden. And there was, I mean, among the Danish refugees in Sweden. And this is also a really sensitive issue in Denmark. You've had your discussions in Norway, I know, but this is also sensitive in Denmark. But there has been some studies that more than suggest that anti-Semitism was actually quite widespread among non-Jewish refugees from Denmark in Sweden. And it probably has to do with the public discourse in Denmark, because throughout the 1930s, if you used anti-Semitic arguments or referred to anti-Semitic fantasies, you were stigmatized as a National Socialist or a Nazi. And not many Danes wanted to be Nazis in the 1930s. So the association between anti-Semitism and Nazism was so close that that if you expressed anti-Semitism, you were a Nazi. So sort of anti-Semitism disappeared from public discourse in the mainstream press. And also what we know of in social gatherings, I mean, in society as a whole. You could not express anti-Semitism without being stigmatized as a Nazi. But what happened when Danish resistance fighters, members of the resistance, fled to Sweden, or intellectuals that were afraid of German persecution, when they fled to Sweden, they were no longer a part of that particular discourse from Danish society. So suddenly you could express anti-Semitic views among themselves, and those are some of the sources that we have to this sensitive issue is the letters that they wrote to each other and that they wrote back to Denmark, because they were intercepted by the Swedish security service. So we have those letters, and they expressed really explicit anti-Semitism of the racist sort. And one of the points that they referred to repeatedly was the particular fact that the delegation was led by a Jew, and that Jews were favored and given special position and so on. So they also engaged in that conspiracist worldview. So you have the entire spectrum of anti-Semitic arguments readily available in these groups, where you would least expect to find it. I mean, that's the really interesting thing. If you find it among members of the Danish resistance in Sweden, it really relates to the fact that these stereotypes were never gone. They just disappeared from public discourse. And this is one aspect that why we should engage ourselves in analysis of public discourse. That's important, but we have to remember that even though it's not there, it might exist, and it might also exist quite well, but it's just not part of public discourse. So that's a historical example of that dilemma.
Thank you very much. And I think the knowledge of having an alibi and then be able to talk about it is a very good point. And the Norwegian letters intercepted by the Swedish security police is just mirrors the Danish letters, actually.
Yeah.
Very good.
That's really interesting, yeah.
Are there any more questions? I would just say thank you very much. And we hope to see you here live one day.
Yeah, me too, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you.
Bye.